My name is Dinah, and I'm 62 years old. I never thought I'd be sitting in a lawyer's office watching my daughter-in-law practically salivate over my husband's fortune. Harold had just passed away 3 weeks ago, and here we were about to hear his final wishes. Sandra sat across from me, her perfectly manicured nails drumming on the mahogany table, that smug smile never leaving her face. She kept glancing at the thick document in Mr. Patterson's hands like it was her lottery ticket. Little did she know Harold had been watching her every move for months. Before I tell you what happened next, please let me know where you're watching from, and hit that like and subscribe button. Trust me, you won't believe how this reading turned out. Harold and I had been married for 35 beautiful years. We met in college when I was studying literature, and he was majoring in business. Back then, he had nothing but ambition and a worn-out jacket he wore to every class. I fell in love with his determination, the way he'd stay up late, making plans for his future. He always said he'd build something amazing for us, and boy did he deliver. Starting with a small construction loan, Harold built his first duplex when we were 25. I remember painting those walls together, our hands covered in cheap latex paint, dreaming about the empire we'd create. One duplex became 2, then 10, then entire apartment complexes. Harold had a gift for seeing potential where others saw problems. He'd buy rundown properties and transform them into beautiful homes. Our son Kenneth came along when we'd been married for 8 years. He was our miracle baby after years of trying. Kenneth was brilliant, getting straight A's without much effort, but he lacked his father's drive. Where Harold was decisive and strong-willed, Kenneth was gentle and sometimes indecisive. Harold worried about this, often telling me he hoped Kenneth would find his backbone before inheriting the business. Everything changed 3 years ago when Kenneth met Sandra at the bank where she worked as a loan officer. She was 28, stunningly beautiful, with platinum blonde hair and emerald green eyes that seemed to calculate everything they saw. The first time Kenneth brought her home for dinner, I noticed how her gaze lingered on our artwork, our furniture, even the silverware. Most people complimented the meal or asked about our family. Sandra asked about our property values. During that first dinner, Sandra steered every conversation toward money. She wanted to know about Harold's business, how many properties we owned, what our retirement plans looked like. When Harold mentioned expanding into commercial real estate, her eyes lit up like Christmas morning. She hung on his every word, asking detailed questions about profit margins and investment strategies. Most young women would have been bored to tears, but Sandra was taking mental notes. Over the following months, I watched Sandra work her magic on both Kenneth and Harold. She'd show up to family dinners with articles about real estate trends, eager to discuss Harold's latest acquisitions. She remembered every detail about his business dealings and would reference them weeks later. Harold was flattered by her interest, while Kenneth was completely smitten. But something about her felt calculated, like she was performing a role rather than genuinely connecting with our family. The red flags became impossible to ignore when Harold started getting sick. What began as fatigue and occasional chest pains turned into something more serious. The doctors ran test after test, and Sandra suddenly became the most attentive person in our lives. She'd bring Harold his favorite soup, fluff his pillows, and sit by his bedside reading business journals aloud. Kenneth was grateful for her care, but I noticed how she'd casually bring up estate planning and inheritance taxes during these tender moments. Sandra's campaign to become indispensable intensified as Harold's health declined. She convinced Kenneth they should get married quickly, claiming she wanted Harold to see his son settled before anything happened. The way she phrased it made her sound selfless, but I caught the urgency in her voice. She wasn't afraid of losing Kenneth. She was afraid of losing her access to the family fortune. Their engagement happened so fast, it made my head spin. 1 month, Sandra was suggesting they move in together, and the next, she was planning a small ceremony in our backyard. She insisted on keeping it simple due to Harold's condition, but I knew she just wanted to secure her position as quickly as possible. Kenneth was so happy, and Harold was so weak, that neither of them questioned the rush. The wedding took place on a sunny Saturday in May. Sandra wore a simple white dress, but her eyes were anything but innocent as she said her vows. I watched her gaze drift to Harold during the ceremony, and I swear I saw dollar signs in her expression. After they kissed, and everyone applauded, Sandra immediately began introducing herself to Harold's business associates as Kenneth's wife and Harold's daughter-in-law, emphasizing her new family status. Once married, Sandra started asserting herself in ways that made my blood run cold. She'd answer Harold's business phone calls claiming she was helping because Kenneth was too emotional to handle his father's affairs. She reorganized Harold's home office, saying she wanted to make things easier for him to find. But I noticed she was also photographing important documents and making copies of files when she thought no one was looking. The most disturbing change was how Sandra began isolating Kenneth from family financial discussions. When Harold tried to talk to his son about the business, Sandra would interrupt with concerns about Harold's health or suggest Kenneth shouldn't be burdened with such heavy topics. She painted herself as protective while systematically cutting Kenneth out of the loop. Harold noticed this, but was too sick to fight it effectively. During Harold's final weeks, he desperately wanted private time with me, but Sandra made it nearly impossible. She appointed herself his primary caregiver and was always hovering nearby. If Harold asked to speak with me alone, Sandra would find reasons to interrupt or insist that she needed to monitor his medication schedule. She was like a guard dog protecting her territory, and that territory was my dying husband. The night before Harold passed away, he managed to get my attention when Sandra stepped out to take a phone call. His voice was barely a whisper, but his words were crystal clear. "Dinah, I've been watching her for months. I know exactly what she's doing. I've prepared for this." He squeezed my hand with what little strength he had left. "Don't worry about Sandra. Everything is exactly as it should be." Harold died the next morning with Kenneth and me by his side. Sandra arrived 20 minutes later claiming traffic had delayed her, but I'd seen her car in the driveway when Harold took his last breath. She'd been sitting outside waiting. The moment she walked into that room and saw Harold was gone, her grief seemed rehearsed. She hugged Kenneth and cried, but her eyes were dry within minutes, already calculating her next moves. The week following Harold's funeral was like living with a stranger who'd invaded my home. Sandra immediately began acting as if she owned everything Harold had built. She rearranged furniture in the living room, claiming she wanted to update the space for everyone's comfort. She started going through Harold's clothes, saying she wanted to donate them before Kenneth got too emotional about parting with his father's belongings. What really infuriated me was how Sandra began giving me instructions in my own house. She'd suggest I might be more comfortable eating breakfast in the kitchen instead of the dining room. She'd recommend I use the guest bathroom instead of the master bathroom, claiming the other one had better lighting for someone my age. Every suggestion was wrapped in fake concern, but the message was clear: I was being pushed out of my own life. Kenneth was too grief-stricken to notice his wife's power grab. He spent most of his time in his old bedroom, going through photo albums and crying over memories of his father. Sandra would comfort him publicly, rubbing his back and bringing him tissues. But I heard her on the phone telling someone that Kenneth's emotional state was actually working in her favor because he wasn't paying attention to practical matters. Mr. Patterson, Harold's longtime attorney, called 3 days after the funeral to schedule the will reading. He'd been our family lawyer for over 20 years and had handled all of Harold's business legal work. When I answered the phone, Sandra immediately asked to take the call, claiming she should handle all legal matters now that she was Kenneth's wife. I refused, and for the first time, I saw real anger flash across her face. That evening, I caught Sandra in Harold's study with the door closed, speaking quietly on her phone. I pressed my ear to the door and heard fragments of her conversation. "$77 million, she said. "Once the will is read, we'll have access to everything. Kenneth won't know how to manage it anyway." She laughed softly. "His mother will be completely dependent on us. She'll have to play by my rules." The night before the will reading, Sandra went shopping for what she called her inheritance outfit. She came home with an expensive black dress, new shoes, and a pearl necklace that cost more than most people's monthly salary. She spent an hour getting ready, styling her hair and applying makeup like she was attending a celebration rather than a legal proceeding about her dead father-in-law's estate. At dinner that final evening, Sandra couldn't contain her excitement. She talked about renovating the house, maybe selling it for something more modern. She mentioned looking into expensive private schools for the children she and Kenneth might have someday. She spoke about everything as if it were already decided, as if Harold's money was already in her bank account. Before going to bed, Sandra cornered me in the hallway. Her voice was sweet, but her words were venomous. "Dinah, I hope you understand that things are going to change tomorrow. Kenneth and I will need to make decisions about the estate, and some of those decisions might be difficult for you. I hope you'll be gracious about adjusting to your new circumstances." She patted my shoulder like I was a child who needed comforting. The morning of the will reading arrived with an unseasonably cold October wind. Mr. Patterson's law office was located in the most prestigious building downtown, with mahogany panels and leather-bound books that spoke of old money and established power. The conference room where we gathered had a massive oval table surrounded by high-backed chairs that made the whole proceeding feel formal and intimidating. Sandra arrived wearing her new black dress and those expensive pearls, looking like she was attending a board meeting where she expected to be elected CEO. She carried a leather portfolio and had brought a pen set as if she anticipated signing important documents immediately. Kenneth wore one of his father's suits, still looking lost and overwhelmed by grief. I chose a simple navy dress that Harold had always said brought out my eyes. Mr. Patterson entered with his assistant, carrying what seemed like an unusually thick file. Harold had always been meticulous about documentation, but this folder was twice the size of what I'd expected. Mr. Patterson was a distinguished man in his 70s who'd known our family since Kenneth was in high school. He greeted us all solemnly, offering his condolences once more before we began. The reading started with the standard legal language about Harold being of sound mind and body when the will was created. Sandra sat straight in her chair, her hands folded perfectly in her lap. But I could see the excitement dancing in her eyes. She kept glancing at the thick document like it contained the secrets to eternal happiness. Mr. Patterson began with smaller bequests. $5,000 to Elena, our housekeeper, who'd been with us for 15 years. $10,000 to Marcus, Harold's driver and handyman. $25,000 each to 3 different charities Harold had supported over the years. With each bequest, Sandra's impatience became more obvious. She started tapping her foot under the table and checking her watch. "Are we going to be here all day going through every tiny donation?" Sandra finally interrupted. "I mean, these are all very nice, but surely the major estate matters are more important." Mr. Patterson looked at her over his glasses with the kind of expression lawyers reserve for people who don't understand proper decorum. Kenneth squeezed Sandra's hand, trying to quiet her, but she pulled away. "I'm sorry, but I think we should prioritize the significant assets. Harold built a $77 million empire, and we're spending time on gardener tips." Her voice carried a sharp edge that made everyone in the room uncomfortable. Mr. Patterson cleared his throat and continued reading. He detailed Harold's business properties, the apartment complexes, the commercial buildings, the vacant lots held for development. As he read each address and its estimated value, Sandra's breathing became more rapid. She was practically vibrating with anticipation, calculating numbers in her head, and probably planning her first luxury purchases. When Mr. Patterson announced the total estate value of $77 million, Sandra actually gasped audibly. She gripped the edge of the table and leaned forward, her eyes wide with what I can only describe as hunger. Kenneth looked shocked by the number, having never fully understood the scope of his father's success. But Sandra looked like someone who'd just been told she'd won the lottery. "Mr. Patterson paused before the main bequest section, looking around the room at each of us. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Sandra was practically bouncing in her chair, unable to contain her excitement any longer. Her carefully composed facade was cracking, revealing the greedy woman underneath. Regarding the primary estate assets valued at $77 million, Mr. Patterson began, his voice measured and professional. Sandra sat up even straighter, if that was possible, her hands gripping her portfolio so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Before Mr. Patterson could finish the sentence, Sandra exploded out of her chair. "I was out of the $77 million," she declared triumphantly, throwing her arms up like she'd just scored a touchdown. Her voice carried across the conference room with absolute confidence and undisguised glee. "Kenneth and I have been planning for this moment," she continued, pacing behind her chair like a general addressing troops. "We've already discussed renovating the main house, maybe knocking down that wall between the kitchen and dining room. And honestly, Dinah, we're going to need you to start looking for your own place. This inheritance comes with responsibilities, and we can't have you interfering with our financial decisions." Kenneth stared at his wife in horror. "Sandra, what are you talking about? Let Mr. Patterson finish reading." But Sandra was on a roll, her true colors blazing like neon signs. "Oh, please, Kenneth. We all know how this works. You're Harold's only child, which means everything comes to you, which means everything comes to us. Dinah gets some token amount to live on, and we get the real estate empire." She turned to me with a smile that was pure venom. "Don't worry, we'll make sure you're comfortable in a nice little apartment somewhere." So that's when Mr. Patterson started laughing. It began as a small chuckle, then grew into full-blown laughter that echoed off the conference room walls. Sandra stopped mid-sentence, confused by this unexpected reaction. "Why are you laughing? This is exactly what we expected." Mr. Patterson tried to compose himself, wiping tears from his eyes. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Johnson. Please let me continue reading the will. I think you'll find Harold's actual wishes quite different from your expectations." Sandra's confidence faltered for just a moment, but she quickly regained her composure. "Different how Kenneth is the only heir. Basic law says the estate goes to the surviving spouse and children. I may not be a lawyer, but I understand inheritance basics." Mr. Patterson's laughter continued in small bursts as he tried to return to the document. "Yes, well, Harold was quite specific about his intentions. Shall we proceed with the actual reading?" "Mr." Patterson cleared his throat and continued with the will, reading, his eyes still twinkling with amusement. "The primary estate assets, including all real estate holdings, business investments, and liquid assets totaling $77 million, are hereby bequeathed in their entirety to my beloved wife, Dinah Johnson." The silence that followed was deafening. Sandra's face went through a remarkable transformation from confusion to disbelief to absolute horror. She grabbed the edge of the table to steady herself, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. "That can't be right. Read it again." Mr. Patterson obliged, reading the sentence word for word. "Furthermore," he continued, "I have established a trust fund of $5 million for my son, Kenneth Johnson, with the following stipulation. These funds will only be accessible if Kenneth divorces Sandra Collins Johnson within 6 months of my death." Sandra's scream could probably be heard 3 floors down. "This is impossible! Harold promised me. He told me I'd be taken care of." She whirled around to face Kenneth. "Your father lied to us. He manipulated us." Kenneth sat in stunned silence, processing the bombshell that his father had essentially paid him $5 million to divorce his wife. His face was pale, and I could see him struggling to understand how his marriage had become a financial transaction in his father's will. "There's more," Mr. Patterson said, pulling out a sealed envelope. "Harold left specific instructions for me to read this letter aloud if Sandra was present at the will reading." He opened the envelope and unfolded a handwritten letter in Harold's distinctive script. "My dear family," Mr. Patterson read, "if you are hearing this letter, it means Sandra is hearing my will for the first time, and I suspect she is not pleased with its contents. I want everyone to understand that these decisions were not made lightly or in spite. but after careful observation and investigation. Sandra was pacing now, muttering under her breath about lawyers and conspiracies. Kenneth remained frozen in his chair, staring at his hands. Mr. Patterson continued reading Harold's letter. 6 months ago, I hired a private investigator after noticing Sandra's unusual interest in our family's financial affairs. What I discovered confirmed my worst suspicions. Sandra has been in contact with her ex-boyfriend, Marcus Williams, throughout her relationship with Kenneth, planning to divorce him immediately after my death and split the inheritance. The room fell silent except for Sandra's sharp intake of breath. Kenneth slowly raised his head to look at his wife, his expression shifting from confusion to betrayal. The investigator recorded several phone conversations. The letter continued, in which Sandra discussed her plans to manipulate Kenneth into signing over power of attorney, then divorce him once she had legal access to the estate. She referred to Kenneth as weak and easy to control, and called me a sick old man who wouldn't last much longer. Kenneth stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. Is this true, Sandra? Were you planning to leave me? Sandra's face was crimson now, caught between rage and humiliation. Those recordings are illegal. This whole thing is a setup. Harold was a paranoid old man who never liked me from the beginning. Mr. Patterson reached into his briefcase and pulled out a small recording device. Harold also left instructions for me to play these recordings if Sandra denied the allegations. He pressed play, and Sandra's voice filled the room, crystal clear and unmistakably hers. Marcus, baby, I'm telling you this plan is foolproof. The old man's dying. Kenneth's a pushover, and once I'm legally part of the family, I can get access to everything. We'll be set for life. The recording continued, playing Sandra's voice, each word driving another nail into the coffin of her carefully constructed facade. Kenneth's so pathetic he'll sign anything I put in front of him, and his mother is just a lonely old woman who'll do whatever I say to keep the peace. I've got them both wrapped around my finger. Kenneth's face went through every stage of grief and fast forward. The betrayal in his eyes was heartbreaking to watch. This was his wife, the woman he'd promised to love and honor, casually discussing his manipulation like a business transaction. How long? He whispered. How long were you planning this? Sandra stopped pacing and faced him defiantly. Since the day I met you, if you want the truth. You think I fell in love with your sparkling personality? You think I was attracted to your backbone? She laughed bitterly. Kenneth, you're a nice enough guy, but you're weak. You've lived in Daddy's shadow your whole life, and you always will. The cruelty in her voice was shocking. This wasn't the composed, caring woman who'd comforted Kenneth through his father's illness. This was someone I'd never seen before, someone capable of extraordinary deception and manipulation. Kenneth recoiled like he'd been slapped. Mr. Patterson stopped the recording. There are 6 more hours of similar conversations, but I think we've heard enough for today. He looked at Kenneth with genuine sympathy. Your father wanted you to know the truth before making any decisions about your marriage or the trust fund. Kenneth stood up slowly, his movements mechanical and deliberate. Sandra, I want you out of the house tonight. Pack whatever belongs to you and leave. I'll have divorce papers drawn up by the end of the week. You can't do this, Sandra shrieked. I have rights. I'm your wife. You can't just throw me out because of some recordings. But even as she protested, I could see the defeat in her eyes. Her grand plan had crumbled, and she knew it. Actually, Mr. Patterson interjected, according to the prenuptial agreement you signed, Sandra, you're entitled to whatever assets you brought into the marriage, which according to these documents was approximately $3,000 in savings and a 2-year-old Honda Civic. Sandra's mouth fell open. What prenuptial agreement? I never signed any prenuptial agreement. Mr. Patterson produced another document. This was signed the day before your wedding. Kenneth, you might remember your father insisting on handling some routine paperwork that morning. Kenneth nodded slowly. He said it was just insurance documentation. I signed whatever he put in front of me. Your father was protecting both of you, Mr. Patterson explained. He hoped he was wrong about Sandra's motivations, but he wanted to ensure Kenneth would be protected if his suspicions proved correct. Sandra grabbed her purse and portfolio, her hands shaking with rage. "This isn't over. I'll contest this will. I'll sue all of you." Harold was clearly mentally incompetent when he made these decisions. Mr. Patterson smiled sadly. Sandra Harold underwent a complete psychological evaluation 2 weeks before signing this will. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, a court-certified psychiatrist, declared him completely competent. That evaluation is part of the legal record. With nowhere left to turn, Sandra stormed toward the door, but before leaving, she turned back one final time. "You all deserve each other. Kenneth, you'll never be half the man your father was. And Dinah, enjoy your money while you can. Money can't buy you a family, and now you don't have one." The door slammed behind her with a finality that seemed to echo through the building. Kenneth collapsed back into his chair, burying his face in his hands. I moved to sit beside him, placing my hand on his shoulder, as he began to cry for the second time in a month, but for completely different reasons. The weeks following the will reading were a mixture of healing and revelation for our family. Kenneth moved back into his childhood bedroom while the divorce proceedings moved forward. Sandra had hired an aggressive attorney who tried every possible angle to contest Harold's will, but Harold's preparation had been thorough. Every document was airtight, every decision legally sound. Kenneth struggled with the betrayal more than the financial implications. He'd spend hours asking me how he'd missed the signs, how he'd been so blind to Sandra's true nature. I tried to help him understand that Sandra had been an expert manipulator, someone who'd made deception her specialty. Harold himself had been fooled initially, which was why he'd hired the private investigator. "Your father didn't tell you about his suspicions because he hoped he was wrong," I explained to Kenneth one evening as we sorted through Harold's personal belongings. "He loved you too much to poison your marriage based on hunches. But he also loved you too much to let you be destroyed by someone who didn't care about you." The divorce was finalized within 3 months. Sandra's attorney tried to claim emotional distress and demanded compensation for psychological damages, but the recorded conversations made those arguments impossible to sustain. She left town immediately after the final hearing, and we never heard from her again. Kenneth gradually began to heal, but more importantly, he began to grow. The experience taught him to trust his instincts and stand up for himself in ways his father had always hoped he would. He started taking an active role in managing Harold's business properties, showing an aptitude for real estate that surprised both of us. I used Harold's inheritance exactly as he would have wanted. A portion went to expanding the charitable foundations he'd supported during his lifetime. Another portion was invested to ensure Kenneth's children, if he ever had any, would have educational opportunities. But the largest portion was put into a trust that would continue Harold's business legacy while providing financial security for our family for generations. 6 months after Sandra left, Kenneth met Jennifer, a teacher at the local elementary school. Their relationship developed slowly and naturally, built on genuine affection rather than financial calculation. Jennifer knew about Kenneth's inheritance but seemed more interested in his kindness and his slowly developing confidence than his bank account. When Kenneth told me he was thinking about proposing to Jennifer, I was nervous about his judgment after the Sandra experience. But watching them together, I could see the difference. Jennifer challenged Kenneth to be better while supporting his growth. Sandra had kept him dependent while planning his destruction. The contrast was striking and encouraging. I found peace in understanding Harold's final gift to our family. He hadn't just protected our financial future. He'd protected Kenneth from a lifetime of manipulation and abuse. Sandra would have destroyed my son's confidence, his self-worth, and ultimately his happiness. Harold's investigation and careful planning had saved Kenneth from years of misery. The money was wonderful, of course, It meant security and options and the ability to help others. But Harold's real inheritance was the truth. He'd given Kenneth the opportunity to see Sandra's real character before it was too late to escape. He'd given me the knowledge that our life together had been genuine, not a target for gold diggers and opportunists. As I reflect on everything that happened, I realize that love sometimes requires difficult choices. Harold could have confronted Sandra directly, but that might have driven her to be more careful, more deceptive. Instead, he documented everything and let her reveal herself completely. It was a painful lesson for Kenneth, but it was also a necessary one. I've learned that sometimes the people who claim to love us the most are the ones planning to hurt us the deepest. But I've also learned that real love, the kind Harold and I shared for 35 years, always finds a way to protect what matters most. Even when death separates us, love continues to guide and guard the people we care about. The lawyer's laughter that day in his office wasn't just amusement at Sandra's presumption. It was recognition of Harold's brilliance, his foresight, and his unwavering love for his family. Harold had orchestrated the perfect ending to Sandra's deception, and Mr. Patterson had been privileged to witness justice served with precision and care. Today, Kenneth is happily married to Jennifer, and they're expecting their first child next spring. Harold's great-grandchild will grow up in a family built on honesty, respect, and genuine love. Sandra's brief presence in our lives serves as a reminder that not everyone who enters our family has our best interests at heart. But it also proves that truth and love will always triumph over deception and greed. What do you think about Harold's decision to investigate Sandra secretly, rather than confronting the situation directly? Have you ever had to deal with someone who manipulated your family for financial gain? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video if Harold's story touched your heart. Subscribe for more true stories about family love, and the links will go to protect the people we care about most. Share this with someone who needs to remember that real love always finds a way to protect what matters. Thank you for listening to my story. And remember that sometimes the greatest gift we can give our loved ones is the truth, even when it's painful. May you always be surrounded by people who love you for who you are, not what you have.